Hello everyone, Rumela here from the 1947 Partition Archive. I hope you had a great Tuesday. Today I am here to welcome you to the launch event series for the Tata Trust Partition Archive University Research Access Points. I am excited to be hosting this launch. We will be there every day this week at 8:30 p.m. Delhi time to tell you a bit about our project. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Rumela and I am Communications Manager Oral History Program at the 1947 Partition Archive. And today I am joining you from Kolkata. In case you are new to following us, the 1947 Partition Archive documents the nearly lost history of partition. Through our flagship oral history project, which is the largest of its kind in South Asia, with your help, we have documented almost 10,000 family stories. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website or speaking to any of our team members. You can visit our online channels to find all the links and content you need. Now I would like to welcome our speaker for this evening, Professor Samir Kumar Das. Professor Das is a faculty grantee of this project and he is a professor of Calcutta University. Let me start by telling you a little about him before we begin the interview. Dr. Das is a professor of political science at University of Calcutta. Previously, he was a vice chancellor of the University of North Bengal and a postdoctoral fellow of the Social Science Research Council South Asia program. He is a coordinator of the University Grants Commission Departmental Research Support Program on Democratic Governance Comparative Perspectives. He served as an adjunct professor of government at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, a visiting professor of the Northeast India Studies program at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He specializes in and writes on issues of ethnicity, identity, security, migration, rights, and justice, and has contributed over 200 research papers to highly esteemed national and international journals and edited volumes. Besides, he has been a regular reviewer of some of the top journals, publishing houses, and research bodies, including Minority Rights International, London, EU India Social Science and Humanities Platform, and European Research Council, etc. Professor Das, we are so glad to have you for today's talk. Your work on transgender stories on the partition is really fascinating. So let's just get started talking about it. So how do you feel about receiving this grant and how it is helpful to your research project?
Thanks, Rumela. And let me begin with a word of thanks to the story team and Partition Archive. Now, I must say that this could not have been better timed in the sense that I am in the midst of a project which is basically on post-colonial hinterlands. And I'm sure that we will have time to sort of reflect on the kind of research that I will be doing for the next few months. Now, the point is that I thought of lining up this Partition Archive work sometime in November. In my application, I actually indicated that month, either November or it could be October. Because I thought that I would be able to physically go to the library and sort of access the material. But it so happened that I would be able to access, and I would have to access the partition stories at home. So I thought that it's better that I finish the work so that I can plow the research findings back into the larger project that I'm looking for, which is post-colonial hinterlands. So in that sense, it is immensely helpful because it's part of a larger project. And let me tell you how it fits into the larger project. Now, usually, you know that the post-colonial is considered as some sort of a determinate time period, which follows the great moment of independence, let's say 15th of August 1947, and anything which follows that is considered as post-colonial. Particularly in my discipline, I am a student of political science. So there is not much talk about problematizing the whole concept of post-colonial at least in my discipline. On the other hand, literary studies, anthropology are well versed with this concept. And so I thought that it's time that sort of understanding the post-colonial from the perspective of my discipline. And in that sense, I look at the post-colonial uh, as a figure which refuses to be dissolved into any of the nation states post the partition of 1947. I mean, if you allow me to borrow a French word which the French philosophers have used, it's called supplement, or supplement, which refuses to be dissolved into the body of the nation. So what is this figure that I'm interested in constructing in course of my research? And that actually took me to the transgenders, to the sexual minorities. And I have been reading a lot of, let's say, testimonies, autobiographies, particularly of quote unquote fallen women, prostitutes, particularly in Bengali, quote unquote prostitutes. These are the words which are to be kept always within quotes. So it's an impossible figure. And the word impossible, I borrow it from Zizek. And there are two other questions which my larger project deals with, which is one, that how is this impossible sought to be governed and with what consequences? Because you know that the challenge is that how you can govern the impossible. So this is one. And the second question is that how does the impossible interrupt and disrupt the conventionally known post-colonial body of the nation? So it always sits uneasily with the nation that has emerged post the partition of 1947. So that is also, these are other two queries. Obviously, these are not directly related to the project that I have been working on with the Partition Archive, but obviously, you know that these are always interrelated. But I must say that this is of immense help, and I must thank the team for being ever so helpful, and particularly my ready at hand translators, because I don't know Punjabi. And I can't speak Hindi, I can't speak Urdu, but although I understand Hindi and I can manage Urdu. So I am always grateful to Kulvinder, to Ikra, because they have always extended help, and Achal also has extended her help for Hindi translation, Hindi part. So hope I can hopefully finish this work by the time which has been given to me, and I'm looking forward to an exciting kind of research. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Das, for sharing that. My next question to you would be, what kind of challenges are you facing while accessing the stories, and how are you solving them?
I think probably you know that before the grant was awarded, you called me up and you said that there would be very few stories of the transgender persons. And you warned me that you would not be getting too many of them. And probably you know that the figure you quoted was something like 5-6 stories. I told you that I expected far less than that number. So in that sense, you know that the stories could have been more, but there is always, you know, that paucity of data, paucity of information. But the stories which the team has provided are of immense help, because you know that not in terms of always corroborating my hypothesis, but that they actually engage, they sort of keep me engaged in the sense that they sort of give me enough food for thought and to pursue these lines of inquiry. Maybe that at some point I would have occasion to sort of share with you some of my findings, preliminary findings though. because I have not been able to sort of process and absorb the readings. And it takes a lot of time, particularly the transcription, because what I do is that I always sort of listen to it very carefully and then sort of transcribe it into writing afterwards. So in that sense, that the first challenge is that there are too few of them. The second challenge is that, interestingly, that I can't reveal the exact location where these interviews are quoted. But unfortunately, that South Asia is a vast region, but all these stories come from a particular area of a particular country. So in other words, I wish that the stories were geographically fairly well spread out, so that this could have sort of provided me with a greater panorama. In other words, that I find difficulties in comparing stories from one place with the stories of the other place, because the stories are concentrated in one particular area, and obviously I won't name it. So this is the second challenge. Although that it's not that there are no written writing on transgenders post the partition, very few of them, and I have referred to them while doing my literature review in the proposal which I have submitted for this research grant. The third challenge, and which is quite a big challenge, I would say, is this: that most of these persons are now very old, and unfortunately, that they belong to the marginalized, quote unquote, excluded sections of the society. And I don't know why there is a necessary association between people being marginalized and poor audio quality. Because when these stories are shot, let's say in California or in other places, the audio quality is very good, the video quality is very good. But particularly, that maybe that these people are not very confident, so their voice falters. So that could be one of the reasons. So I have literally to sort of scrounge the story from the questioner, from the interrogator, rather than from the responses. Because fortunately, that the person, and it's the same person who has interviewed all the 5-6 transgender persons. So it's thanks to the interviewer that I get to know what they have said. And the interviewer has literally summarized the responses, because the audio quality is extremely poor. And in some cases, that even my translators could not make any headway in many places, that they just write within bracket audio inaudible or something like that. So that's another challenge, and many of them do have faded memory. I can refer to one of them who constantly confuses the partition with the 1965 war. And that becomes a problem. Maybe that the questions were not very clear to him or her. So that could be one of the reasons. They are not confident, maybe because they belong to the marginalized section, so they are not very articulate, and you don't expect the same level of articulation. So these are two or three challenges. But I must thank once again the team, because they have so great, so helpful to me. So that way, I think that's very important. But I would rather suggest, and if you allow me to make this suggestion, that when probably that you must take extra care while interviewing, particularly people belonging to the marginalized sections. In other words, that your interrogation must exude a sense of, must inculcate in them a sense of confidence. That in many cases, I don't know whether it's electronically possible, but my sort of computer buffs, they say that it's possible to reduce the background noise, the surrounding noise. In one case, for instance, there is constantly the, how do you put it, the a crowd of uh, hens were shouting. So you have constant background noise of, you have of these birds always creating noise. So these are some of the problems, but I guess that that's not the archive's failure, but I have to face all these challenges. And at the end of the day, I'm pretty much hopeful that I would be able to sort of, and let me tell you that I am quite satisfied with the progress of my work, because this is exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
That's great to hear, Professor Das. So coming to my next question, can you tell us about your earlier research work, and can you talk about like how this specific research is related to your earlier works and how you're going to relate it to your future research works?
Future work probably I have reflected on, and maybe that if time permits, I will further reflect on it. But my earlier works, let me tell you that I began more or less as a partition researcher. Although my PhD work is not on partition research, it's on students' movement in Assam in the Northeast. And if I can remember, and if I can sort of retrace my footprints, my first research work was on the rehabilitation and relief and rehabilitation policies of the government of West Bengal, particularly relating to the partition refugees. The western part was done by a very eminent person, Ritu Menon, but the eastern part was given to me. So I was sort of, my confidence was cracking, because I was very young, and so you know that I have to write something which would compare with the writing of Ritu Menon. So that's how it all began. I worked in the Secretariat Library, I'm sorry, the Assembly Library in West Bengal, and I worked in archives, West Bengal State Archives, and elsewhere as well. So this was basically an archival work. The second, afterwards, I wrote an essay, which is quite a long essay, which came out in a book published from Sage, which was basically on the IndoPak Wars. And my assumption was, my hypothesis was that, does partition offer any clue to understand these wars, the nature of these wars between India and Pakistan, and how, for instance, it triggers off the displacement of population, whether it's 65 war, 71 war is a great moment which triggered off partition. In what way, for instance, the migration of 1971 compares with the partition, the post-partition migration, and what happened between 1947 and 1971. Because in 1964 as well, after the communal riot, again, you know that you have another spate of partition which South Asia has witnessed. My third work on partition was that I was interested in understanding the nature of insurgency and militancy in the Northeast, a region which is always troubled till the other day. Now, I wrote on insurgency extensively, but while reading, for instance, particularly very closely the ideologies of these insurgent organizations, I think that the partition serves as the originary moment, in the sense that, I mean, I give you one example, because this is not the forum where I can extensively talk about my earlier research. Now, let me give you one instance. If you read, for instance, the Manipuri insurgents, their entire argument is this, that why was Kabo Valley given to Myanmar, Burma, then Burma? Why, for instance, Sylhet went to Pakistan, East Pakistan? So Sylhet partition played a very important role in understanding the politics of Assam. and subsequently the insurgency in Assam. So why should Barak Valley be part of Assam? Uh, so these are some of the questions which were asked. But let me tell you in what way, for instance, and subsequently, as my research progressed, you know that I could understand that partition doesn't create just one border between nation states, but partition creates many other kinds of borders. And these borders remain folded in the international borders. For instance, the border that separates India from Pakistan or vice versa also separates two gender groups. In other words, it contributes to the reproduction of patriarchy. Why is it that a national body, the body of the nation, is also tinged with a particular community? Why is it that so these are the questions which continue to bother me. And in that context, you know that I tried to understand the partition and its impact on the transgenders. I will refer to two things here. One thing is this, that in what way my current research is different from earlier researches. In two ways. One is this, that my earlier researches were focused on macro trends. For instance, how did the state react? What were the relief and rehabilitation policies? So, you know, it was basically logistic issues. Where will they be rehabilitated? How are they to be employed? What kind of land will be given to the peasants, for instance, Namashudra peasants who came late? So those were the questions which I dealt with. But now, for instance, I'm more interested in sort of nuanced understanding of micro issues, the individual issues, the emotions, individual passions, so on and so forth. So that's a major shift that has occurred. The second is that earlier I was interested in understanding the bodies that were partitioned by way of drawing the borders. For instance, the nation, the Indian nation, the Pakistani nation, and then Bangladeshi nation that emerged in 1971. But now my focus is precisely on the border, in the sense that how do you do with those groups and communities which don't belong to any of the bodies created after partition? So in other words, I would describe them as border people, because they are neither here nor there. And one of the findings which I have been able to sort of tease out from my readings of the archive, Partition Archive, and particularly the target group that I'm looking for, is this, that almost across the board, they're not interested in revisiting the place they were born in. So you know that there is no special kind of affinity or attachment to the place where they were born. This is number one. And number two is this, nor are they interested in revisiting those places. So you know that they are out of place, and I'm sort of using this phrase from Edward Said's autobiography. So they are out of place, whether in their quote unquote the place where they were born, and they are out of place where they went to. So they are not the people who can be dissolved into the body, either of India or of Pakistan or of Bangladesh, for instance. So I would describe them as border people. They are the liminal people. I mean, I'm using a term which is used in social theory. Victor Turner used it, liminal people, neither here nor there. And remember that it's very interesting that they're actually looking for a land which they can claim as their land, and where they don't let the non-transgender people to creep in to inhabit. So a land of their own. At least in one of the testimonies that I have come across, you know that imaginary land is what drives many of their practices, subsequent practices. So I'm enjoying my research, and so in that sense, you know that the second shift that has occurred is from the body to the border, to the border itself. We thought that border is a thin line, but it's not, because border is also the habitation, is also inhabited by a lot of people who don't have any place in the body. So I'm interested in knowing their part of the story. Thank
That's
you.
great. Thank you, Dr. Das, for sharing all your insights and all your understanding so far. While I was reading your introduction, I read out that you have you have majorly published on partition and transgender studies. So, can you talk a bit about your papers and your journals that you have published on this subject?
I have sort of given you some impression of what I have written on partition. Although I must say that I have never published a book on partition. I have written long essays on partition. They can be collected into a book, but I never felt encouraged to write a book on partition, because basically, that these are my macro issues, and whatever I have written are macro issues. And I never thought that partition can be written with a sense of completeness. I have always compared, and I tell my students that, look, partition is like a huge carpet, and which might take 1,000 years to unfold its real design and pattern. So in that sense, that it's an unfolding process. Partition is not a one-time event. And in that sense, that one of my hypotheses, and Partition Archive doesn't provide me with any clue how I can actually decipher it, is this, that I thought that these people, and I have reason to believe that these people, the transgender people, they usually sort of cross the border effortlessly. And particularly in Tripura, I have written testimonies that for 3 months, 4 months of the year, they spend in Tripura, and then they go back to Bangladesh, and without any documents, without any papers. So in that sense, that they are constantly in touch with each other. In other words, there are trans-border solidarities. But because Partition Archive interviews people who have seen partition that way, or who must have been born before partition, so I think that this doesn't give me enough clue of how they can actually move around. In that sense, that I do not know whether it comes under the mandate of Partition Archive, but it has done excellent work. But in that sense, I would, if we assume that partition is not sort of a one-shot event, but it's a constantly unfolding event. So can the ambit of Partition Archive be widened to include those who may not have seen partition, but are partition people? I can include myself in that category because I come from a partition family. My mother lost many of her family members during partition. My father was also displaced by partition. And many of the non-transgender testimonies which I am hearing now actually are the stories which my parents have told me. So you can say that I am a partition person. And I have, and that this is the reason why I would say that this ambit could have been widened to, because that the partition generation is lost. They're either dead or are almost, are unable to sort of articulate themselves. So what about the second generation second partition generation, who may not have seen partition, but have lived partition, quote unquote, in their memories, in everything? Now, I give you, I don't know how we are faring in terms of time, but I just sort of refer to one thing, that that when I first visited my ancestral place in Dhaka. Believe me, I did not have to ask anyone. My father gave me the fullest uh, description of the place. So it's like sort of going and feeling that this is the place where perhaps I lived at some point of time. Uh, the place is now occupied. It's an altogether different story. But you know that the directions uh, about the location are so vivid that I didn't have to ask anyone. So that way, so in that sense, that you may have lost the partition generation, but there is another generation which can actually tell you more about partition, stories being retold. And it's like the shruti, which you inherit from your parents and continue to sort of impart to your future generations. So I think that part, that the dynamism of the stories may be factored in at some time. But I know that it's a very sort of daunting task, in the sense that I guess that you have already chronicled about 10,000 stories, uh, and it might cause extra burden to you. But I'm just asking myself that why don't we do it? Thank you.
Yeah, taking from there, as you correctly pointed out, Dr. Das, we have already recorded 10,000 partition witnesses stories. And while we are doing that, our focus was, since this is the disappearing generation, as we call it, like they are more than
Hmm.
73, 74 now. So when we started the work, our primary focus was to get started by recording their stories. But we also do have provision for second generation account. What we do is we ask the family, like you said, that you lived the life of partition, but you are not a partition witness directly. So for those, we have the provision of submitting a second generation account, and we are doing that. We are coming up with more system to document those stories, but primarily we are focusing on the first generation because we think that that is
Yes.
fastly disappearing as a generation. But we definitely consider your suggestion, and that's a wonderful suggestion, and we are working on it, and we will take it more. So coming to my last question before we go ahead and take more questions from the audience. Why transgenders? Like, why did you decide to work on transgender and partition?
See, I guess this was in 2016. I was a visiting professor uh, at Université Sorbonne, Paris North. Uh, at that time, it was known as Paris 13. Uh, and I was teaching post-colonial studies there. Uh, I am never I'm not a literature person, but I don't know. I was asked to teach at least one novel of partition, and I thought of many novels which I have read, but I thought that it's better because it's a very flat novel. Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan is a very flat kind of novel, and I thought that it would be easier for me to sort of steer through that novel. And there, interestingly, at least it's a story which is spread across a couple of pages, where, for instance, a group of hijras, and hijras wrongly translated as hermaphrodites, because hermaphrodites are only one part of the entire spectrum of hijras. It said that a group of hijras was detained by the Sikhs somewhere in Punjab, and they were sought to be deported from there to Pakistan. And the Hijras took up the issue, saying that, why are you sending us to Pakistan? We have never seen Pakistan. We have always been here. So why on earth you are sending us to Pakistan? And then the Sikhs said, nothing doing. We are not going to allow you to stay here. And it so happened, and then that they started sort of clapping and shouting in their raucous voice. These are all words which are used in that book. But interestingly, that in the conversation, one of the hijras told the Sikhs, the crowd of Sikhs that collected there, and if I can exactly remember the sentence which they said, why will you stop reproducing children? Because you know that one of the things that these hijras do is to sort of dance with the children, newly born children, on their lap. In other words, this was taken as an insult. Sort of, it was shaking the quote unquote the masculinity of the Sikhs. So that's how I became interested in it. Do the hijras have a different, and you know that we had a very heated conversation in at least two classes in the university, and many of my students who were Algerians or who were Moroccans, they felt fascinated about it. But many of the people who were coming from quote unquote the Western developed Western countries, they could not discover the punch in those words, some way or the other. In other words, the class was ethnically divided. And I just stepped back and felt relaxed, and I was enjoying the discussion that was taking place amongst the students. That was a food for thought. So if I ever write a book, I will always remain thankful to that batch of students that made me think. And that made me write this proposal here at this point. And this is how it all began. I'm so happy that they actually sort of made me think. And they are still in touch with me, and they are inquisitive about what I'm doing in terms of my research on the transgenders and partition. So I suspect, and my first hypothesis is that they must have seen partition in a way which is different from the way Hindus see or the Muslims see. About my future kind of research, I would say that this research, this access to Partition Archive, has also have its spin-off effects, in the sense that I got something extra, more than what, for instance, transgender testimonies could give me. Number one is that I never knew that even the Sindhis actually wanted part of Sindh. And one of the testimonies, for instance, tells me that if Punjab could be divided, why not Sindh? And why not a part of Karachi could be given to India? So this is one kind of story. So you know that these are the remainders which refuse to be dissolved into the nation. The second is, how did the communists, for instance, look upon partition? Here is one testimony whose great grandfathers were associated with what we in Bengali call Chattogram Ostragal Lunthon, the armory raid in Chittagong during the freedom movement. So, and he was an avid follower of Communist Party. So you know that what does partition mean to him? So this is another question which became very important for me. So these are, you know, that the extras which I have collected, and maybe at some point I will sort of keep writing some non-serious or maybe non-academic essays on these and sort of test waters, and then at some point I hope I will be able to concentrate and write one or two research articles on these spin-off effects of my research. Thank you.
That would be great, Professor Dash, and we should look forward to your writings. So thank you so much for answering those questions. So now we would like to take some audience questions. So if you have any questions, please type your questions into the comment boxes, and we will choose some of them to ask Dr. Das. So if you have any questions, kindly write it down in the comment box.
I saw one or two questions on the scroll bar. I may have missed them.
Okay, can we have the question?
On the connection of transgendered people with partition. I think the connection is all about my research. And uh, if you allow me to sort of share one or two of my findings, I would say that partition does what? Partition creates nations. Uh, and it makes you forget what you have been in the pre-partition era. You have been, for instance, together, uh, and you are obliged to sort of emphasize on on your separateness. And partition gives unto itself a history of its own. Uh, so you have to recreate the history. Now, the about the transgendered people, the problem is that, uh, like I said, that uh, they don't think that the land they were born is their homeland. Nor do they think that they are wherever they have resettled is their homeland. So you know that they are still in search of a land of their own, land of their own. One of the transgendered persons, for instance, has said that we need to have a land of our own. And she was being told by the interviewer that, look, these concentrated settlements, highly ethnic settlements, actually are, do not allow you to sort of mix with others and do not contribute to the creation of the nation. And this person's answer is very significant, that what I have no interest in my nation. I am interested in our people. So that way, you know that how do, in other words, if I can sort of sum it up in a very, very different way, one is this, that partition gives you a menu of options. It, in a sense, you know that you have the freedom to choose which side of the border you will settle yourself in. But at the same time, it's a limited choice because you will have to operate within the menu. What about those possibilities which were ruled out by partition? For instance, there could have been a separate state for the Sindhis. There could have been, for instance, a separate kind of dispensation had communist movement been successful at that point of time. So these were several possibilities. In other words, you know that one has to understand that partition kills many other possibilities and gives unto itself its own history. Uh, and as a researcher, our task would be to retrieve those possibilities. Now, what history could have been, but had never been so. I would describe it as contra-history. Perhaps Foucault will describe it as heterotopia.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Das, for answering the question from the audience. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you love our oral history work and our mission, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations as an NGO. So in some countries, donations are tax-free, and we have the links in the description to this video. So thank you once again, Dr. Das, for giving us this time, and I wish you good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.